Dr. Jim Lange holds a faculty position as coordinator of alcohol and other drug initiatives within the Wellbeing and Health Promotion Department of San Diego State University's Division of Student Affairs. Through a relationship with the Ohio State University, he also serves as the executive director of the Higher Education Center for Alcohol and Drug Misuse Prevention and Recovery, as an academic center of OSU's College of Social Work. The Higher Ed Center serves as a technical advising resource for colleges and universities across the United States on topics concerning the continuum of issues involving student alcohol and drug use. From his various research grants, Dr. Lange has authored over 60 scientific publications that have been cited more than 3,700 times. Dr. Lange also is currently serving on the advisory board for SAMHSA's Prevention Technology Transfer Center. And he completed his undergraduate education at Pitzer College and his doctoral work in social psychology at the University of Maryland College Park. Before coming to OSU in 2001, he was senior research scientist at PIRE, the Pacific Institute for Research and Evaluation.
Thanks for the introduction and the description of the Higher Ed Center. Just so you know, if you're interested, take a look at our offerings. I'll have a slide at the end. We do have a national meeting coming up that might interest some folks if you are especially interested in collegiate AOD issues. I'm going to talk about the cannabis sales environment in various ways. This is more sort of a free-ranging discussion than like a set of studies. So we'll see how this goes. And sure I can slide. There we go. When we start thinking about the sales environments that are cropping up across the nation, of course, it's state by state, and it's also under various rubrics. So it could be adult use. It also could be medical, or it could be both. There's different sort of regulatory environments, but all of these concepts will kind of have layers. So if you know the social ecological model, we tend to think of the individual, but the individual is wrapped around their relationships and the institutions around them and the community, and all of these things interact. So if you're interested in making an impact on some of the harms associated with alcohol, cannabis, or other, it's useful to be mindful of all of these different layers. So this is kind of a brain dump of various places we can start. We can start thinking about the, and a lot of this is informed by the work that I've and many others have done in alcohol, which is a much more established field in terms of looking at these environments. So we know that various regulatory environments exist, and they can have various features that include hours of operation, enforcement, licensing, age restrictions. But within cannabis, you also have doctors, and the process of perhaps getting a medical recommendation. People have focused on the location of dispensaries and also like alcohol outlets. That's often talking about density and also the proximity to other properties. The property itself has been identified as one of the things that contributes to, with alcohol, things like violence and other crimes. Whether or not there's on-premise use, the various sales practice. So is there security, the hours, how the clerks interact with the customers. Now with both alcohol and cannabis, now in many states there's delivery. Across the nation, people started allowing delivery of alcohol where it had not been in the past. That's one of the things that people are identifying as probably something that may stay as COVID wanes and people got used to the idea of delivery. And then also we talk about the specific substance, so the dosage, the form, and now the branding. as well. There's advertising, there's consumer knowledge. All of these pieces together kind of help frame the environment in which which any of these products, whether it's alcohol or cannabis or others, are being purchased and consumed. So I took a little look. I don't know if everyone's gone on Weedmaps, but it's a really nice way of finding out your at least density and location of various outlets. And so I took a look at Oklahoma City. I know that's not necessarily where everyone is, but picked the biggest city I could find. So it was interesting. And one of the reasons why I'm even doing this talk is I reached out to Dr. Croft and when I read an article about the dispensary gold rush environment that seems to be happening in Oklahoma. And when you look at Weedmaps, it really does appear to be rather intense. So this is just a screenshot. It's the first 100 outlets that they list. There are 7 pages of those 100 outlets. It expands out. So it's a very high density with a relatively small population compared to, took a look at San Diego, which is where I'm at right now, that has a population of, something almost twice. And we have of licensed dispensaries with storefronts less than 50 in the city. And while they are clustered, so you see a bit of density, it's quite a bit less. And then also, but we do have something that I don't think you do, which is delivery licenses. So we have many, many more who do not have storefronts, but are delivering. I don't know how much business they're getting. That's hard to track, but they, and their location is kind of, in some ways unimportant because they're delivering, so you can call any of them. And so these are just parts of the feature that of the sales environment that is useful to be considering. Now, what I was coming from, the orientation I was coming from was coming from the alcohol world, where we have something called responsible beverage service. And that's often a training program, but it's much richer, and I'll go into that a bit. But the idea of responsible beverage service kind of rests on the idea of responsible. What does responsible mean? And I think it's really important that we understand that that's a changing target. So what I'm showing here is an ad that I got off eBay. This was from when we had offices in which a colleague of mine, Dr. John Clabb, and I sort of decided we were going to decorate our offices entirely from eBay, and it would be themed. So he had liquor licenses, and I had early prevention material. So this was a magazine ad from the House of Seagram that came out in 1938. So it was very soon after Prohibition. And I won't read the whole thing, but it may be difficult for some to see it, but it says, no person should pay your bills first. No person should spend a cent for liquor until the necessities of living are provided and paid for. Bills for groceries, clothes, shoes, rent, light, heat, doctors' bills, such as these have the first call on America's payroll. Now, I just want you to imagine for a minute that one of the companies currently selling alcohol would do this as one of their responsibility messages. It would seem incredibly foreign to us. But it makes perfect sense in the historical context of where Prohibition came from and the women's temperance movement, and the arguments for Prohibition often rested on the idea that men were getting drunk and not taking care of women. And so as alcohol became legal again, the companies sought to show that they are being responsible and they want others to be responsible. And so they took that message to essentially the men of America and telling them not to mess up again. So that's then. Now, I think it's fair to say that drunk driving is one of the major elements of what's driving responsibility in alcohol now. In fact, even though it was long known that alcohol was impairing to drivers, it wasn't until about the 80s that things started really shifting as MAD started creating the agenda to make changes. And now we have uniform age 21 laws with alcohol. And it was primarily the argument that it was, that impaired driving was disproportionately impacting young people. And it needed to be uniform across the states so that there weren't bloody borders between states. And that became sort of the definition of responsibility. Now, I think over-intoxication remains an issue, but it is now, I think, more of the question. Actually, when I ask people about the age 21 law, and why do you think we picked 21? It's interesting. Often I'll get people who kind of vaguely respond, well, isn't it about brain development? Which is something that is actually very recent that people have been talking about. Age 21 goes back to probably about the Magna Carta, and it's far more based on the ability of men to ride a horse in full armor. And that's where the age of adulthood, actually it was knighthood at that time, became age 21. And so this is a very old concept of this age, had nothing to do with responsibility of alcohol. In fact, fighting in war was one of the reasons that the age was lowered to 18, because in World War II, horses weren't necessary, neither were full armor, but lots of people were. And so Roosevelt opened the draft to 18-year-olds. And that's when we started seeing alcohol follow down in age on that. But that Seagram's, House of Seagram's ad, I think is a really nice predictor of what the sorts of responsibility you get when corporate define responsibility and their responsibility messaging. And so here I just recently pulled this up from a dispensary here in San Diego. It looks like a sort of Starbucks type dispensary. You walk in, it's very modern, nice wood flooring and that sort of thing. But it's signaling that they are responsible and they care about the community, but it isn't actually asking anyone to do anything different with their products. They are just telling me, and when you talk to the alcohol industry folks as well, many times you'll get neither the sense or the direct statement that their measurement for their responsibility messages is actually corporate people's attitudes about the corporation and the brand than the actual behavior change. So we got to define what responsible is. And with cannabis, this has been difficult because it's been illegal. And so a lot of times we're stuck with the arguments about whether or not people should be using it at all, or whether or not it should be available. And all of that's great, except we often aren't at the table when those decisions are made. And so we have to adapt as the laws have been changing and the access has been changing as well. So what might be things we want to look at? For instance, the age. It's been fascinating that as states have started allowing adult use, all have set age 21 as the law. There's no, of course, federal requirement that they do that because federal government hasn't changed at all. It's more just keeping it consistent with the alcohol age. But that may not be the most appropriate age. We would need to, if you want to look at research, but socially it may make sense. But when you start talking about medical use, pretty much all have set 18 for when someone can do it on their own, get the medical recommendation of the cannabis on their own. But I think most states allow even minors to use, they just would need parental consent on that. So there's the age. There is concern about the developmental impact of use early on. There's also concern about overdose. It's not always called overdose with cannabis, but it certainly occurs where people go into emergency rooms having consumed way too much. So that kind of sounds like overdose. There's unintentional consumption concerns. There's the community impact of intoxication. There is some evidence that cannabis use disorders are linked to the use of high dose, high concentration THC products, and also its impact on mental health. There's some long-term issues. Those are still kind of in flux. Something often not considered too often is tolerance and that impact. We'll see if we can get to that in this presentation. Impaired driving is something that I think will again be a major part of what we consider responsible and other aspects of this. But there's also these medical claims. And so a lot of times right now when we're talking about the sales environment, we're talking about it in the context of what people are being told that cannabis can do for them. A caveat to anything I'm saying. This is a chart of the research publications that have used the word cannabis, marijuana, spelled two different ways. A lot is happening in the field. It has been literally an exponential growth. And so there's no way anyone actually is keeping up with this literature. So I'm not either. This isn't going to be a full review of all the literature. It's going to be more concepts, and there's still plenty of research to be done. Okay, so not only the research is changing, but we have a growth in the changing political and social environment. As we are talking to people about cannabis, things have changed. Back when I started talking to folks about some of these concepts, back in 2010 and before, basically I was activating a political mindset. There were people in my audience who just wanted to attack me no matter what I said. I got attacked on every side. And that's because they were activated to make the changes that are happening in the politics of this. In California, after it passed, that stopped. The challenges were done and people were interested in other topics. So this is sort of rolling across the nation, that different people are taking this into a political realm and then they're moving into other realms. There's changes in the markets. There's been a lot of change in the products. So when I started looking at some of this, most of it was still dried flower, leaf, the identifiable. And now it's far less that. It is much more of a processed and packaged product, and which is really conforms to the American ethic of consumerism. Think about your grocery stores and whether or not there's aisles and aisles and aisles of fresh produce and ingredients for you to use, or is it aisles and aisles of packaged products that are manufactured? And there's a lot of economic reasons for that. It's very hard to put a brand on a dried piece of plant matter. And so the brand is where the value comes in, where you can start charging a lot more, because cannabis actually is pretty easy to grow and it will not keep generating the sorts of prices as it becomes legal. So the profit is going to be in the processing and packaging and branding, which is exactly what happens to wheat and all other commodities. That will conform to changes in use and social patterns of use and the change in stigma of use. So just want to do a little thought experiment in terms of RBS, because sometimes responsible beverage service, sometimes people say, well, is that an evidence-based approach? Yes, there's some evidence that shows that it works if it works. So the training doesn't always change behavior, but you can impact drinking through changes in the environment. And so there's a protective environments like you either monitor or prohibit underage people from entering it. Intoxication monitoring, limitations of consumption, higher drink prices, that could be through taxes or just change the price. The normative environments are important. All of these pieces on the left have been shown to impact consumption, responsible consumption. So if you're defining it as no underage, well, don't put underage people in there, you won't get drinking there. The opposite is true as well. You can create environments that really promote and contribute to the consumption. Probably the most stark environments I've encountered was across the border in Tijuana, where bars and restaurants catered to American young people who crossed the border, drank quite a bit. In fact, sometimes there was something called a popper where a server would just grab the person's head, tip it back, pour tequila down their throat, shake their head and blow a whistle, and then ask for $1. And that, of course, is going to contribute to overconsumption. So you can create environments that are going to contribute to it. So if you can create ones that contribute to consumption, and you can identify things that would reduce that consumption or the overconsumption, then you can imagine that you can train people and get them to construct environments that are more protective. This is a really ugly slide, but I'm going to send them to you and you can read it at some point if you'd like. There's so much to think about in terms of what we're talking about in creating these sorts of environments. So this is adapted from something, a presentation I did with Bill DeYoung, working with pilot cities of the AB InBev Global Smart Drinking Initiative. And you can strengthen all of those elements that we're talking about, the pricing, the discounts, the servers are managing pushing alcohol versus watching for intoxication, restricting home delivery, changing the drinking age. All of those are important components that we've identified with alcohol. But with cannabis, it's different. We haven't really spent much time thinking about the responsible sales and these sorts of aspects. Now, most of cannabis is sold in dispensaries that don't allow consumption on their property. So this is more like the package sale of alcohol that we're talking about. The server isn't necessarily looking for people who are over intoxicated. But we can start looking at the products because those are probably the most rapid change, but also the way that the clerks are interacting with the patrons. So I put some of the more egregious products that are easily found. So for instance, THC gummy bears. There's a lot of concern about those. And in California, for instance, they made it illegal to sell animal-shaped THC products, partly because young people either intentionally think that they are for them or accidentally consume them because they look just like other products. And note the THC quantities in some of these. So that bag of gummies is 300 milligrams of THC. A lot of people don't know, and this is a consumer education, what a sort of standard or typical dose of THC kind of should be in a product. And actually, there's a lot of question of how this got set, but most states are setting it at 10 milligrams as a dose. And that actually is about twice the threshold dose of cannabis. You can, most people who do not have tolerance to THC will feel it at 5 or even less than 5 milligrams. So 10 as a dose set is probably too much for those who are very infrequent users. That said, 10 is becoming somewhat standard. Maybe we can make that change eventually, but not right away. So these bags of gummy bears that easily could be consumed in one sitting have 300 milligrams of THC. And so there's no wonder why we're seeing young people children sometimes ending up in emergency rooms when products like this exist. This brownie has 1,000 milligrams, not easily divided into tens. Goldfish, 350 milligrams in a small pack. So these sort of sales practices really don't lend themselves to that responsible cannabis sales concept. But some of these other concepts that I've listed here do. This is also a changing landscape in terms of regulation. It seems like forever ago, but it was really only just a year ago, a little over a year ago, that there was a outbreak of lung injury that was happening and eventually discovered to be centered around cannabis vaping products. Those were often called counterfeit, but actually that would imply that there's real ones. These were sort of garage-made vaping pens or cartridges with THC in them, but they were packaged in ways that made them look quite legitimate. And so they looked very much like what you would see in a regulated store, but they weren't being sold in regulated stores. Unfortunately, it looks like it was vitamin E was included in these, and that should not be inhaled. And so there was quite a bit of harm being done. But that was clearly caught and changed. So the incidence went down just before COVID hit. But it was a concern, but it also shows the value that can come from a regulated industry. So these were garage-made ones that were not happening and seen in the licensed establishments. So there's the benefits of a well-regulated marketplace that can help protect the consumer. Now, consumers couldn't tell whether or not there was vitamin E in the regulated products because the ingredients aren't always included on packaging, so that can still be improved. Took a look at Weedmaps, as I said, started clicking down, and here's a brownie that can be purchased in Oklahoma City. That's 220 milligrams at one of the dispensaries. So to me, that tells me that there isn't a regulation that says that it has to be easily divided into 10 milligram dosage. In California, you can't sell a product that has more than 100 milligrams within the package. And in Colorado, they actually require that each divisible element has to have a stamp on it that shows that it is a cannabis product, so that as it's broken apart, people don't lose where it came from and that it should not be given to children. So those are the elements that we're learning along the way of what responsible packaging and product creation should look like. But there's still a lot of advice being given. And so it's like, why are people using it is an important component. So if it's a medical rubric that people are in, then they have to sort of understand how to use cannabis to help their particular condition. But there actually is very little research on all the variations of cannabis and their impact on expected outcomes. So, for instance, there's this website called Leafly. If you ever want to learn more about the different strains of cannabis, you can find out that some things help you relax or make you happy or euphoric. Now, all of that's just based on user input. That there isn't like randomized trials of various strains that can inform this. This is as much expectations as it is the product itself. And we really don't have a way of teasing that out. Some products are really trying to find their niche in that sort of well-packaged, produced way. This is a vape pen called Dosist. Its feature is that as you inhale, it signals you when you should stop so that you could have a particular dose. There's no evidence that people inhale the same way on this, so I don't know that this is actually a legitimate medical product in that sense, but they have different formulations for sleep, calm, relief, arouse, all of those based on those sort of user accounts of how the expectation of the effects. And you'll see these, and some of them are just kind of strange. So this was at a local store near SDSU, Windmill Farms. They had this product out. This is just CBD, so it had no THC or very little THC in it. But somehow they were claiming that these different versions of it were sativa, hybrid, and indica. Those would be things that would draw someone towards the THC to CBD content, but make no sense in a CBD only product. And again, there's no marketing regulation on medical claims at this point. FDA is supposed to be doing some work on this, but it's not clear that anything is really happening. In terms of the research, like sleep is one of the things people often talk about, and I just wanted to see how easy it is to find a randomized placebo trial of cannabis strains on sleep. Can't find any, only user testimonials. But what happens if you just say herbal tea? Well, the first four things are with those sort of randomized trials. So they can be done. Obviously, it's harder with cannabis, and I understand that. But you saw that curve early on. Research is exploding, but we're not yet seeing the sort of strain-specific claims being demonstrated in a lab. And you know, in the lab would have to consider a whole lot of other concerns. So for instance, the THC action in the body is very different if it's inhaled versus it's eaten. And so when they're talking about strains and those eaten forms, it's an entirely different consumption method and probably a different effect. And the idea of what responsible is around these vary as well. So for instance, if you look at the right, that's with the eaten form, and it's hours and hours of high levels of psychoactive activity of both THC and the psychoactive metabolites. And impaired driving is going to be impacted for hours and hours and hours. But for the inhaled forms, it is a much shorter time frame. And so we need to come up with ways of informing the consumer, but also those selling to have proper warnings and proper use if those are going to exist. There's also confusion around the effects of cannabis and the effects of withdrawal relief of cannabis. Many of the symptoms that people say they experience, that they're trying to use cannabis to alleviate, are identical to the feelings and issues that withdrawal occurs. And withdrawal can start to peak actually a full week after cessation. And so it can be difficult to tie the two and put people into this cycle of use, even when they are taking breaks from cannabis. But insomnia and vivid dreams are some of the things people say they use cannabis for, but those are actually withdrawal symptoms for cannabis. And so it's a very difficult nut to crack if you're trying to demonstrate the effectiveness of these. I want to try a video because I think it's really useful for people to understand this idea of tolerance as well, because it impacts how we talk to people. There are different sort of experiences people will have based on their tolerance. And this video is going to show the speaker, who is a professional in the field and I want you to hear the amount that he's consuming and watch his behavior and his apparent impairment. So this is going to be the challenge. We're going to go and cross our fingers. How
I did a strikeout with some 99 peaches in the other one.
Just been going hard already. I'm so burnt.
Alright, well we're going to keep going because we had a fail.
I think
It wasn't a fail, it was just a video just stopped working.
Just a quick note of what a strikeout is. He took a hit, then he took a shot, then he downed a beer, and then he blew the smoke out. That happened off video.
We've been chilling for like 20, 30 minutes. Brock's like 7 dabs in. This is great.
I'm knocking domes over.
I don't know where this guy's at. I don't know where he's at. I'm no dabs in. I'm like 5 in.
Naps is drinking.
Just been drinking. Not too hard, just drinking natty like. Sipping.
I did a perfect strikeout, no cough though.
Yeah,
Yeah.
That's probably a Nick for that. For the no cough. Like no cough.
I'll probably cough real bad now.
Right.
Alright, this is that Wheezy, right?
That's a Wheezy. Yeah. Wow. I just dabbed the Wheezy too. So tasty, nice and smooth. That's what that's
Cough again. I feel it.
There you go. That's how faded he is. He's just not coughing. He's just kind of.
Well, I tell these people, I try to, you guys are my friends, you guys know me.
Yeah.
A lot of times for my videos, I literally don't blaze before my videos.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, I might like just wake up, not blaze for 12 hours or something. They don't understand how much that affects your cough,
Yeah.
you know?
Obviously, you're not doing, because your lungs aren't at full capacity when you're just waking up.
That's why I always get a kick. They're like, you're a pussy. It's like, guys, you don't know. I mean, I might have been trimming all night and then fell asleep, and then, like, you're just catching me. You started my session. Yeah.
Yours came out
With my
nice
big
and
ones, you could really slam them, you know?
How many times have you done the green crack? Is this like the second? First? Nice.
The thing is I used to go to OGH all the time.
Dabbing, talking, drinking.
And I knew the guy who actually grew it, too.
Edible high.
It's a nice little numbness.
You got that?
Yeah, I do.
That's the last of the second one for him. He ate 2 so far.
They're 180 milligrams. Pretty rocking.
I think that's what they say the triple X keeps the ball
He's
going.
eating 360 milligrams tonight.
Yeah, he's already done 2 of them.
180 weight.
So let's process that. If you saw impairment, it's very light. He said he feels a bit numb. We learn at the end, he's already eaten 360 milligrams of a chocolate. We watched him do 2 dabs, which are high concentrate THC. He's been drinking, and he did some of this off camera as well. If you were looking for slurring, if you were looking for loss of coordination, if you're looking for signs of intoxication, you're not seeing very dramatic ones. And so this is, I think, really important for the field to understand the level of tolerance that some people are exhibiting and how different that is from novel users and the products. And I think a lot of these products are designed more for that heavy tolerance folks than the folks who do not want to experience that. So running out of time, but I'm going to just sort of mention this idea of training. So is there training available right now? Right now appears that bud tenders, they're often called, can get training. There isn't a requirement for them, but these sort of trainings are more about product information, maybe some of the local laws, but not about how to responsibly sell, not about how to warn about tolerance or withdrawals, not about moving people down the THC dosage and warning about where the appropriate use is and or the issue of impaired driving. And a lot of medical claims. I've gone into a number of dispensaries and I got quite a bit of unsolicited advice about what I should be looking for based on me and what they think I want. But it's a really interesting process. But yes, people will be guided towards different strains, different modes. They will be given the expectation of what they will feel like if they use this product versus that. All of that is probably planting seeds for actually feeling those things. They may not be real. They're basically the suggestions. The proper dose is often way higher than probably should be considered for most people. All of these components could be what would be in a training environment, but is not currently being offered in the sort of industry sponsored types of trainings that are just helping people get a job into the next dispensary by saying that they are trained in this. And then what we learned from alcohol is that just training the servers is never enough. What we need is a whole look at that ecological model. It has to be a well-regulated environment. And I'm working with folks, for instance, in Brazil to try to develop responsible beverage service training, and they don't have liquor licenses. And so to come up with ways to get people to get trained is really challenging when you can't just say, you got to, there's a license. Even knowing where the establishments are that are selling is difficult in an unregulated environment. You have to find ways of finding the stores to get to the employees. So a well-regulated environment is kind of the baseline of what you would need to deploy this sort of training. But then there's the other side. The consumers need to be supportive of this. The community needs to understand its importance, and the consumer needs to understand more about the product. I don't think very many people understand what now is being determined to be the standards dose, and that the standard dose, if you're an uninitiated and or tolerant consumer, is probably going to be very uncomfortable for you and should not be what you're striving for. This is the sort of education that exists more in alcohol than in cannabis right now. In fact, for alcohol, here's an example of a BAC chart that every Californian gets when they get either their driver's license or registration. This is in the envelope. We take it seriously, teaching people what the BAC limits are and how to avoid crossing them. Even if we don't have a per se THC limit, it behooves us to be telling people how long should you wait after you've consumed, and that it matters greatly whether or not it was an eaten form versus a smoked form, and whether or not you were drinking along the way. And we understand that tolerance is going to be different for everyone, but in terms of what your impact on the road is, it may not be the same. So these are the sorts of concerns as we're thinking about the sort of growing market of cannabis, understanding that we want responsible sales. If sales are going to happen at all, we need to define what that means, and we need to come up with the environments that will facilitate those.